The microbiome used to be diverse, used to be capable, used to educate the immune system. And so it would be, if those things are no longer true today, then what are some of the action items that we can think about? You mentioned that, having turmeric or curcumin, as an anti-inflammatory to try to bring down systemic inflammation is akin to trying to put out, the LA fires with a garden hose. What would be some of the actionable strategies that we can talk about that can help with promoting, patching up some of the leakiness, the leaky holes in that system?
So it's multifactorial, and I've now written 10 books on how to do it. And I just signed a contract for another 2. I'm glutton for punishment. But anyhow, because we learn really more and more on how what it takes to do this. And I guess the more we learn, the more challenging it gets. When I started treating leaky gut 25 years ago, I thought, this is a piece of cake. I can fix leaky gut in a couple of weeks. And, boy, was I naive.
Books later.
10 books later.
Yeah.
Most people, it legitimately takes 9 months to a year to repair leaky gut. It's the longest it's ever taken one of my patients, believe it or not, 4 years. Mm-hmm. And that's an exception, but I certainly seen it definitely take more than a year in many cases. And again, that's, wow, why the heck does it take so long? And I think it comes down to one of the things that was a great blessing of the Human Microbiome Project, which was actually completed in 2017, the year the Plant Paradox was published. And I did not have a lot of the knowledge that we now have from the Human Microbiome Project. But people like Usham, who was battling with Pasteur, who I talk about in this current book, for supremacy of the germ theory of disease causation. Anyhow, leaky gut can occur when we swallow plant compounds like lectins or like oxalates. And we used to have an incredibly useful defense system against these plant compounds. It's a balance of powers between plants that don't want to eat them and animals that do want to eat them. And plants have their mechanisms of defense, which, among other things, are lectins and oxalates and phytates. And animals have their own mechanisms of counteracting these, and that was primarily our microbiome. There is a microbiome that can eat gluten, love it. We know there's a microbiome that can eat oxalates. And people who have oxalate stones are sensitive to oxalates. When we look at their microbiome, they don't have any oxalate-eating bacteria. So no wonder they're sensitive to oxalates. So that balance of power was pretty doggone good. And then really the middle 1970s was really the turning point in almost everything bad that happened to us. And I was actually in medical school in the mid-1970s. And looking back, I got to witness all of this happening in real time. So what happened? Number one, broad-spectrum antibiotics were introduced. And I can remember that they were miraculous because before the use of broad-spectrum antibiotics, if we were treating an infection, number one, we had to culture the bacteria. And a great number of these bacteria we couldn't grow. We didn't know that then, but let's suppose we did grow them. And then we would have to test these bacteria against various antibiotics and figure out which antibiotic would work and which wouldn't. And this would take days. And these were really sick people. And a great number of them died. So when broad-spectrum antibiotics were created in the middle 70s, all of a sudden now we had an AK-47, with a 200-gun magazine load. I mean, bullet load set on automatic. And we
to squash an ant, to squash the equivalent of an ant.
we could just mow these guys down. And
Yeah.
I mean, they were miraculous. I mean, it was just like, oh my gosh, you know, we have Pasteur was right. We are the kingdom. We have conquered the germ kingdom, and they are ours, and we are the victors. Little did we know that our microbiome, which we didn't even really knew existed, was being killed, particularly by oral broad spectrum antibiotics. We had no idea that this would have happened. So that's kind of number one. Number two, what order should we take? Let's take NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. Now, back in the good old days, aspirin was really one of our mainstays against a lot of autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, for instance. Mm-hmm. And one of the downsides of aspirin, as many people my age know, is that it really was pretty good at causing gastric ulcers in the stomach. And so pharmaceutical companies learned that you could develop non-steroidal anti-inflammatories that did their damage not in the stomach, but they did their damage down in the small intestine. And the damage wasn't as extensive as aspirin would cause, but these drugs were considered so dangerous that in the mid-1970s when they were introduced, you could only write a prescription for Advil or Aleve or Naproxen for 2 weeks. And it had to be a prescription only. And you could only fill it for 2 weeks because they were too dangerous. And I remember those days. Why? Because the pharmaceutical companies knew, and there's wonderful documents that show this, that a gastroscope, we could see ulcers in the stomach. And we could see ulcers in the first part of the duodenum, but we couldn't get below that. And the damage that these agents did was down in the small bowel, where we couldn't see. And so they said, hey, this is a great pain reliever, and it doesn't cause holes in the stomach, and here you go. And of course now we now know that it's like swallowing a hand grenade. You can produce holes in the small intestines extremely easily with NSAIDs. And I got interested in them because early in my treating of autoimmune diseases, I used to see a number of athletes who would just out of the blue develop Crohn's or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus following an injury. And they were treated with high-dose anti-inflammatory drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I've written about this in some of my previous books, but these things, this was known about to the drug companies. And now these things are, the number one selling pharmaceutical product in the world. And we swallow them like candy. And what's fascinating is drug companies know the more you swallow, the more leaky gut you cause. The leaky gut causes more activation of the immune system, which causes more inflammation. And the more inflammation you get, the more of these you will take. And then, of course, you'll get upgraded to opioids because those things will finally stop working. And they knew about this. So that's number two. Number three is glyphosate, Roundup. So glyphosate was patented by Monsanto in the 1970s as an antibiotic. It was not patented as a weed killer. And it was just almost through serendipity that they learned that glyphosate in the water of a pond, and I think it was in Missouri, all the plants, all the algae in the pond died from glyphosate being thrown out in the wastewater. And they go, wow, look at that, nothing's living in there. And isn't that cool? And the rest is history. They realized that they could genetically engineer soybeans and then corn to resist the action of glyphosate and killing them. And again, the rest is history. But so originally it was used as a treatment of GMO crops. So you could spray the soybeans and they wouldn't die, but all the other weeds would die. You could spray the corn and it wouldn't die, and all the other weeds would die, et cetera, et cetera. And GMO got an ugly name, and people go, oh, I don't buy GMO food, ooh, evil. Big agriculture, and I grew up in Nebraska, big agriculture knows that it is much more efficient to harvest a plant when it is dead. It is much more efficient to harvest corn when the corn stalk is dead. It is much more efficient to harvest wheat when the wheat stalk is dead. Oats, dead. Because water is a pain in the neck to deal with in hauling. It costs you money to haul wet things, but it's much cheaper to haul dry things. So fast forward about 15 years ago, smart people said, gee, we've got all these expensive harvesting equipment, and it would be really nice to know that on September 1st, in this patch in Iowa, the corn will be dead, and we can have our machines there. And it would be great to know that on September 7th, in this patch in Nebraska, that corn will be dead or the wheat will be dead, and we can have our machine there. So how are we going to accomplish that? Well, we've got this great plant killer called Roundup, and what we'll do is we'll just spray these conventional crops with Roundup as a desiccant. And then we can harvest these crops. And they won't be GMO crops. They'll be conventional crops. And we don't have to tell anybody that they're being sprayed with Roundup because the FDA, in its wisdom, says that Roundup is harmless to humans. Shall I continue with how that was determined?
Yeah, why don't we just to round out the story, tell us why that was determined to
The
be
only
safe
reason I can
for humans.
tell this story
Yeah.
is I love, so plants live and their cell function uses what's called the shikimate pathway. And it's such a fun word, shikimate.
It sounds like you're swearing, but
it
you're
does,
not.
doesn't it? Yeah, I don't swear, but shikimate is pretty good. So they determined, which is true, that animals don't have the shikimate pathway. They don't use the shikimate pathway. Mm-hmm. So that it would be perfectly fine to spray plants with Roundup and feed them to animals because it's totally harmless to animals, which quote unquote is true. And the FDA says, yep, we get it. Now, they didn't bother to mention that they already knew that bacteria use the shikimate pathway. That's how they patented it as an antibiotic. And those of us who are, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but mitochondria are bacteria. They have bacterial DNA, and they use the shikimate pathway. So lo and behold, unknowingly, glyphosate was introduced to our food supply to make most conventional grains easy to harvest. And nobody said, well, you better wash this stuff off because it's dangerous, because it's not dangerous to humans. The FDA says it's perfectly safe. So what happens? So these conventional food products are fed to our animals, and that gets incorporated in their flesh, but probably more importantly, they get incorporated into our conventional products, our grain products, our bread products, our soybean products, a great number of our oil products because it's much easier to harvest these things. And so, as unfortunately most people know, glyphosate is everywhere in us. It's in most California wines, for goodness sakes. And we can measure glyphosate levels in humans, and most of the time it's pretty scary. The Environmental Working Group, Consumer Reports have tested numbers of American products, grain products. Most organic oats are contaminated with glyphosate. So what we've done is we've inadvertently used antibiotics in our food in the form of glyphosate to, again, decimate this population of our microbiome. And as I write about gut-brain paradox, it even gets worse. The ones that are most affected to glyphosate are the tryptophan pathway producing bacteria, the serotonin producing guys. And so isn't it odd that since the 1970s, the incidence of anxiety and depression has gone through the roof? Now, let's not discount social media, let's not discount COVID, but there's a pretty good graph that just follows anxiety and depression beginning in the mid-70s. And okay, so that's the glyphosate story. So you've got really kind of a triple punch, and there's more that we can go into. Let's go into microplastics, but that's another story.